Rant Session, Episode 55, Culture Across the Decades. Go. Today we're talking politics. Culture. I love so many parts of it. The good, the bad, the bad, the bad, the bad, the bad. But listen, I'm not just a blind fanboy of this stuff. I am more so a culture enjoyer, more than willing to acknowledge its faults if need be. Calvin Coolidge, weird guy. So since I'm such a well-rounded culture enjoyer, I thought it would be fun to go through all the decades of American culture from the 1900s onward, compare and contrast them, and see which one comes out on top. I won't be judging these decades based strictly on historical events, but more so the general quality of life. How much would Lawson like to live in these decades? Also, I'm going over strictly Western culture. If you're a fan of everything Kazakhstan, this video is not for you. The 1900s and 1910s. I grouped these together because really, tell me one difference between these two that you can think of. This one was a little bit more farmy, this one had a world war, insignificant differences. Generally, you lived on a farm with your extended family, raised and ate your own food, and you were pretty secluded from the rest of the world. I don't think I'd dislike this. But Lawson, life was so much harder, you had to work all day, there was barely air conditioning, horses smell bad. Listen, I've said this before, but even with all the problems of this living, it seems like it would have been pretty enjoyable. I would like this style of living. Please take me back. The 1920s. Calvin Coolidge was president. And boy, was this the start of the America we all know and love today. Financial irresponsibility and lust. Women became a solid part of the American workforce. African Americans experienced much more freedom and a cultural renaissance. All of this gets my seal of approval, and it drastically changed American living. Many inventions gave people more free time to spend sinning. Stuff like refrigerators and washing machines added much more convenience to everyday life, while the increasing affordability of cars changed how cities were laid out. Stores began selling sliced bread, which is the best invention since something. This was the start of the modern life. And history looks at it like it was a utopia. It's called the Roaring Twenties for a reason. It seems like no matter who you were having a good time. But I gotta say, it feels kind of vain. Like, yeah, you were having fun, but you were really just living for the weekend, not really seeking a higher purpose. And I feel like the following decade is proof of the fun but fragile nature that the 1920s carried. The 1930s. Consequences. Everything was bad, no one had money, you ate on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, if you were lucky. How did things get like this? This is an opinion piece, not a history lesson. I think it's safe to say that living during this time wouldn't have been fun. I'm just gonna give it a little... There you go. The 1940s and 1950s. This time period really seems to be the America that Americans wish to return to. If you ever hear an elderly person talking about when the cars were the fastest, the television was black and white, and they could say just all the words, they're talking about this time period. And you know, maybe it's the herd mentality influencing me, but I feel like this would have been a pretty nice time to live. Technology had integrated itself into daily life enough to make things convenient and entertaining, but not so much to where you relied on it to drown out your loneliness. Modern but not postmodern, fun but not overstimulated. James Dean, love your sandwiches. The 1960s and 1970s. Perhaps I'm ill-informed in wanting to live in the 50s because they clearly didn't like it. While economically and structurally things weren't all too different, culture and specifically pop culture shifted entirely. It seems like whatever was bubbling under the surface in previous decades was now fully on display. Racial divide, war, and who caused it, people were now seeing these things like never before, and they were reacting to it. Constant civil unrest and rebellion, for better or worse, was everywhere. This is also the start of what I consider modern culture. People still listen to a lot of the music from this time period, acts like Jimi Hendrix, the Beatles, and Elton John, and a lot of the celebrities and athletes are still talked about. So while day-to-day life wasn't all too different, the sheer amount of civil unrest and social confrontation brings it down a couple notches in my simple little mind. The 1980s and 1990s. These decades carry a similar reputation to the 50s in that everyone wants to go back to them just so bad. Even now, people try their hardest to replicate the aesthetics of the 80s and 90s, and that's gotta speak for something. We're getting pretty close to the modern day, so the social issues weren't as much should women vote and were more can you swear in your rock music. And by the time the 90s rolled around, yes, you could. At-home video game consoles started in the 70s, but come on. Did it start for me in the 70s? These decades are starting to bleed together a little bit. I wonder if there will be any innovation in the future. The 2000s. No, go back, go back, go back, go back! Well, innovation came in the form of the smartphone. The future! Now everyone is connected and you can watch anything you want at all times on the internet. How can that go wrong? To be fair, it really didn't go wrong in this decade. At the time, it was fun and fresh, and it offered new ways to experience life as opposed to being the way to experience life. There was an economic crisis, gotta keep us on our toes. I lived this one a little bit. It was the start of something good that would eventually become bad. The 2010s. I lived this one all the way through, and I can definitely say this decade is the one where the internet truly became the culture. Even in the late 2000s, there was the internet and then the real world. In this decade, the internet in many ways became the real world. Major news stories began involving more and more of what happened on online spaces, and every time something did happen in the real world, people mainly cared about what others online had to say about it. So this decade is totally different because we started with the internet, but I wouldn't say it was bad. The internet-induced brain rot definitely isn't good, but it could have been much worse. Trust me, we'll get to that. Overall, this was a downhill effect from the 2000s with the internet, but not quite the crash. The 2020s. The crash. Is it safe to say this decade is not as good as the last? Internet-induced brain rot is back and better than ever. This decade started off with the requirement that everyone stay inside and be online if you wanted to stay afloat. Everyone is fully dependent on the internet now, and there's really no argument against that, and we are feeling the full effect. Pair that with the civil unrest of the 60s and the economic situation of the 2000s, and you've got just a fun one. Well, that concludes my ranking, and looking at my final scores, 80-year-olds really were living it up back in the day. I have the two earliest decades sandwiched in between two of the most recent decades, which is interesting. Somewhere in between internet innovation and internet dependence, I want to be a farmer. I think the real question is, where do we go from here? We seem to be kind of riding a low with the internet overload right now, and I feel like everyone's main hope is that we can learn to navigate it better moving forward. Rant session over. Also, all of these average out to about a 3.2, which means that American life is a 3.2. Now if we're talking Kazakhstan,